When you think of Omar Khayyam, you probably think of poetry, right? Wine, roses, living for the moment. But what if I told you he was also a world-class scientist, a legit master of algebra and astronomy? So how on earth does one mind hold both of those things at once? Today, we're diving deep, past the famous verses, to find the hidden mental engine that connected the scientist to the poet. Let's get into it.
And this, right here, is the paradox that's at the very heart of his story. This is a man who spent his whole life chasing knowledge, pushing the limits of math and science, only to end up here. The more he figured out, the more he realized just how much was totally unknowable. That tension, that push and pull, that's the key to everything.
All right, so here's our game plan for unpacking this. First, we'll look at those two seemingly opposite sides of Khayyam. Then, we'll bring in a modern cognitive model to actually map out his mind. We'll trace his creative cycle, figure out the core problem that kept him going, and then, finally, see how his poetry was the ultimate balancing act.
Okay, first up, the two minds of Khayyam. Let's really set the stage here and look at this clash between the scientist and the poet. The difference between these two personas is just wild. On one side, you have the scientist. This is the brain of pure structure, of A plus B equals C logic. This is the guy solving complex equations and reforming the Persian calendar with insane precision. And on the other side, the poet, a mind that just soaks in sensory details, the taste of wine, the look of a rose, the feeling of moonlight. This is the Khayyam asking the huge, messy, existential questions. How can these two possibly be the same guy?
To solve that puzzle, we need a new kind of tool. And luckily, there's a modern theory called the Brain Kinematics Model, we'll just call it the BKM, that gives us a perfect map for his incredible mental landscape.
So, put simply, the BKM doesn't see the mind as this fixed, static thing. It sees it as a system that's always in motion, constantly trying to balance two totally fundamental ways of thinking. And that idea of balance is everything when it comes to understanding Khayyam.
The BKM breaks our thinking down into two modes. First, there's the algorithmic continuum. Think of this as your brain's superlogical processor. It's what Khayyam used for all that science stuff. It's stable, structured, and follows the rules. Then you've got the emotional continuum. This is where all the sensory stuff, the metaphors, and the intense, fast-moving feelings live. It's the source of all his poetry. You see it now, right? The scientist lived on the algorithmic highway, the poet in the emotional landscape. But here's the real breakthrough. These two modes weren't living in separate houses. No way. They were locked together in this constant looping dance, a creative cycle that basically explains how his genius actually worked.
So according to the BKM, his mind followed this four-step cycle over and over. First, you get this long algorithmic buildup. He's deep in the zone, total focus on a math problem. Then, bam, an emotional disruption, a sensory hit, seeing a rose, tasting wine, and it just shatters that focus. And this leads to the magic moment, creative coupling. For a short time, his logical brain and his emotional brain are perfectly in sync. The result? His philosophical poetry. And finally, he hits an emotional release where pure imagery takes over. It relieves all that mental strain. And then the cycle starts all over again.
But you gotta ask, right? What kept this whole thing moving? Why didn't he just find a happy medium and stay there? Well, now we're gonna look at the powerful engine that kept this cycle spinning forever.
So let's just ask it straight up. What was the fuel for this constant back and forth between logic and emotion?
The answer is a really cool concept called a cognitive attractor. And for Khayyam, that attractor was the inaccessible reality. It's this deep, profound, unshakable feeling that the ultimate truth, the real meaning of it all, is forever just out of reach.
And this feeling was being fed by two massive forces. The first was totally personal. The better he got at science, the more he pushed logic to its edge, the clearer he could see the wall where knowledge just stops. His own brilliance showed him his own limits. The second driver was historical. I mean, he was living in 11th and 12th century Persia, a time of incredible political chaos and religious conflict. The world around him was reinforcing this deep sense of impermanence, that nothing lasts. Those two things together made the problem of being, the sun that his entire mental solar system revolved around.
So how does this all tie back to his poems, his famous rubaiyat? Well, as we're about to see, this whole mental process, the two modes, the cycle, that big unresolved problem, it's not just a theory. He literally wrote the instruction manual for it right into his verses. If we use this BKM framework, we can decode his most famous themes. Let's take wine. When he talks about wine and drunkenness, it's not just about, getting drunk. It's a symbol. It stands for a cognitive phase shift. It's his mind finding what the source calls a convenient corner, a way to intentionally hit the mute button on that rigid logical part of his brain, so that the creative part could come out and play.
And you can feel this in the poems themselves. So many of his quatrains feel like daydreams, don't they? They're written to sound like that half-awake state, where sensory images and these logic-light ideas can just float around together freely, without any strict rules.
This classic is the perfect example. It's not a logical argument. It's a snapshot of a feeling, a mental state. It's all sensory immersion: the book, the wine, the bread, the person next to you. It's a logic-light daydream where the emotional brain is 100% in charge, creating its own little perfect moment of paradise.
So what this all means is that for Omar Khayyam, poetry wasn't just a hobby. It was a vital, biological function. It was, in a sense, cognitive homeostasis. It was the pressure release valve that his brain absolutely needed to balance the immense strain of his scientific work and keep from burning out on the biggest, most impossible questions. His art was literally a survival mechanism.
And that leaves us with one last big, provocative idea. It's easy to look at Khayyam and see a frustrated nihilist, trapped by a cosmic question he could never answer. But what if we're looking at it all wrong? What if that inaccessible reality, that unresolved problem, wasn't his prison? What if it was the engine, the fuel for his genius, the thing that powered his science, his philosophy, and his poetry? Maybe the problem wasn't the obstacle at all. Maybe, for a mind like his, the problem was the path.